We are very privileged to have Eric Schmidt join us tonight. He's actually spoken at my conferences when he was at a prior company, but I met with him about 6 months ago when we were at a dinner together, and I really presented him the Corporate Eco Forum program, and he asked that he be a keynote, and he said, look, MR, if I have the time on my schedule, I'll do it. And fortunately, he had time on his calendar. So Eric is a very passionate individual, as an individual and a person, about the green initiatives and the green movement. And also Google, as a company, has undertaken numerous initiatives in this space, done a lot of experimentation, and really helping make a big, big impact on the eco agenda. So as you know, this is a forum for Global 500 companies, and who better to have be our keynote than a Global 500 CEO. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Eric Schmidt.
Hi, Amar. Thank you very much. No, this is it's a fun group, and it's been a fun conference for the day. Shall we get the screen up? And what I thought we would begin with is what's a dinner without a few presentations? We don't use PowerPoint anymore. We use some better technology. And I have with me Michael Jones. Raise your hand, Michael. And Michael happens to be the inventor of Google Earth. And is a good personal friend. And I asked him to sort of, if he were going to talk about the Earth in the way that he loves it and that all of us love it, how would he talk about it? And curiously, Michael, you have us starting at our hotel. So where are we going next?
Well, let's find out where we are.
We're at the Fairmont, Michael.
A small piece of the Earth.
So one of the first things we looked at was, what are people doing with Google Earth with respect to climate change? Are they in fact using this as a tool to try to understand what happens? And there's this interesting group called the Hadley Met Office, which is the UK official weather and climate information research center, and the British Antarctic Center created this sort of layer. And what's interesting about this layer is that as the temperature goes up, it sort of starts off it's blue is the normal temperature, and then as temperature goes up, you see it changing and changing. And what's interesting is you take the innovation, say it's 2020, and I'm using midpoint projections here for climate change. North America, 2 degrees Celsius, so what is that? 3, 4 degrees, no big deal. Kind of warmer is better probably anyway, right? But in the North Pole, it's 15 degrees Celsius. So you see the little ice cap up there? It's going to be really nice, all those open shipping lanes, right? That's the way I like to think about it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of other things that happen up there, as everybody knows, including basically all of the wildlife and all the trees are gone. But we're not done yet. They then basically take us out to 2050, which is 5 degrees Celsius, which again is kind of toasty here in our part of the world. It's 40 degrees in the North Pole. So if you think there's any ice up there, you're not paying attention to freezing point. And of course, it's all open, it's all gone, right? Along with probably 1/6 of the world's plant life. Oh yeah, well, we had enough. We have the other 5/6, right?
Right.
You get the idea. This is a very, very, very tragic scenario. Keep going, Michael. So what happens, of course, is that it gets higher, it gets even worse. So what we thought we'd do is, can government policies make a difference? So we thought, well, are there some examples? Everyone's always saying, well, nobody can do anything about this. So what are some examples of government policies? So here's an example. Mexico and Guatemala, okay? And show us the border, Michael. Actually, sorry, this is over 74 through 90, basically today. And there's the border, the difference in policies of Mexico versus Guatemala. Kind of interesting. You could just see it as a straight line, or in this case, as a corner. Go ahead. Let's go to, anybody been to Uruguay? Well-run country. Which side is Brazil and which side is Uruguay? This is a trick question. Uruguay is on the lower and Brazil's on the upper. Anybody care to know what the border looks like? There it is. Okay, let's zoom in. By the way, you see the trees there on the left, on the right? Those are little trees that they planted. Government policy does make a difference. Now, another question, can any of you make a difference? Of course we can. There's a fella in Texas whose name is Lukey who decided to make a difference. And Michael, you promised me this is a real picture. You didn't just add this. Okay, you promise? Okay, these are half-mile long letters. And by the way, that is a power line, in case you're wondering. Those are the tall power lines, because you can't plant trees next to the power lines. It gives you a sense of the scale of, a lot of people say Lucky, but his correct pronunciation is Lukey. This is a guy who had a vision that he could make a difference. And he did with a little bit of marketing. So when we sort of do these policies, we have to have some policies about where do we want to spend our money. Google, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, has invested $10 million in enhanced geothermal, which I want to talk about a little bit. And what you do is enhanced geothermal, I think people here know, is you basically, there's a lot of heat inside the earth, right? Remember this as children? It's like really hot. That's why you can't dig to China. That doesn't work. There's a reason. But basically, if you go down a little bit, there's heat. But the heat varies, right? So here's a chart of the suitability of states for enhanced geothermal. And what's interesting, of course, is the western states have a higher suitability. Again, let's make decisions with facts. It's a big country. We've got a lot of choices. Let's put those things where they make a difference. Keep going. Showing the circulation pattern. So here's an example of the temperature of depth. Now, we used 5.5 kilometers because that's sort of a reasonable depth to use oil drilling equipment to get down there and start playing with this. And again, you can see there's a fair amount of temperature there that's available. And we're talking about temperature of 150 to 200 degrees Celsius. And by the way, the temperature doesn't stop. If you sort of don't run out of it. There's a lot underneath there. So we calculated that if you dug down 5.5 kilometers in a 2% calorie, we'd have 15,000 megawatts of energy annually in California, for example. Now, anybody here been to, it's the San Gorgonio Pass. It's the pass when you're driving from LA to Palm Springs. Everybody ever see all those, everybody sees that, right? So here we are, and Michael's now driving along. And the wind farms there generate 893 gigawatt hours of electricity a year. It's probably one of the best places in America. And basically, the average wind speeds there is about 20 miles per hour. So again, you can see them here. You can see them on Google Earth. And there's plenty of things that you can do with this. Now let's take a look at Google. And as an aside, so I went to, one of the first meetings I went to, they said, did you know, I would start those things, did you know that 40% of climate contributions, CO2 contributions, are coming from buildings? And, I don't really know much about this. And they said, and it's a big problem. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I thought, I could actually do something about this. I actually have a lot of buildings. Big deal, right? Google's a big place. So I called the facilities people in and I said, what are we doing about energy efficiency? And they said, oh, well, we leased the buildings, we bought these ones, the usual sort of answers. And I said, well, anybody know how much it would cost to make these buildings very efficient? And here you see the Google campus. And the initial estimate was $5 million a year. So, excuse me, $5 million in capital. And I said, well, that's a lot of money. I try to sort of look like a CEO. And everybody asks you $5 million, say it's a lot of money because you want it to be cheaper, right? It's easy to. So I said $5 million. And I said, well, how long is the payback? And they said 2.5 years. And I said, the payback on a $5 million capital investment is 2.5 years, and you haven't done it already? And they said, no, we didn't have permission. I said, you don't have to ask permission for that kind of payback. Like, what? In other words, what's wrong with you? But I learned something, and I learned something that in normal corporations, and I suspect all of you have this problem, nobody asks the questions in an integrated way. $5 million, immediate payback, like, what's not to like about this? Furthermore, this was when gas was half the price and electricity was cheaper. And one of the things that people, and again, business people will understand this, is savings compound infinitely when prices go up. This is an easy thing to understand. Right? Very, very easy to understand. When prices go up, you already got the savings get bigger, not less. Right? It's called increasing savings. I've just invented it. Okay. Why this is missing in corporate accounting is beyond me. Somehow they don't get this. So then I said, well, what else could we do? And they said, well, we actually have some ideas about using solar, and we'll build carports for all the cars. And we'll put solar on top. And in fact, here we have a meter which shows you our scoreboard, which we have dynamic systems inside our company, in our campus, which show you by building how we're doing against power usage, and we use lots of electricity, and of course the contribution from solar. And my point here is not that these are hard to do, these are simple to do, but somebody had to do them. So the question is, have you done them in your company? And if you haven't, why not? It's just a scorecard, and it's just capital with a very, very quick payback. In our case, we had a lot of fun with this, and about a year and a half ago when it was completed, it was the largest private installation of solar on top of the roofs of the buildings that we own. And by the way, the savings continue. The payback is incredible. Payback was less than 10 years, and that's ignoring all the various subsidies, which of course we were happy to pocket. So 8 buildings, 2 carports, the total utility meter, the Building 40 dashboard, which we're showing you now. And here again, you can show the contribution from solar, you can show the net contribution and the total demand. We can monitor this, we can understand it, and we can go forward. Michael, take us back to where we started here. Here we are at Google. Come back up to San Francisco, I think.
Yes, sir.
And what's interesting about this kind of a tool is you didn't realize what life was like after you started using it. How did you operate without it? So here we are again. But of course, we're not really there. We're actually up on the top part of that building right there. And it's not really daytime. It's kind of dusk. And by the way, anybody look out the window, do you see the Golden Gate Bridge? Because it's obscured by fog, but in Google Earth, you can see it 100%. So with that, thank you very much, Michael. So I wanted to show you that because I think it helps when people can see it. You can see how you can make a difference and so forth. Unfortunately, what I've concluded is that people in this room get it. A lot of people that I know get it. But we have a total failure of political leadership, at least in the United States, and perhaps in the world, on these issues. It is a fundamental failure of leadership, and it comes from, let's start talking about the things that really threaten civilization. Well, obviously, nuclear proliferation. That's something which many people worked on when we were born or when we were young. And the other one is climate change. Certainly life as we know it is now clearly threatened by this thing over the next 50 to 75 years. And what's interesting to me is that as a political dialogue, there is a lack of understanding of the value of global alliances. There's a lack of understanding of the benefits of technology and how technology can actually change the dialogue. There's a lack of understanding that there's an opportunity before us that is a massive opportunity that solves a lot of these problems at once. And so it seems to me that this is time to seize the moment. And I think what I would like to lay down tonight is it's time for everybody to get off their rear ends and start taking this seriously. So here's my argument. It's very simple. I'm not a politician. The government is about to do a massive stimulus package. They're going to reward all their usual friends depending on who their friends are. Because why? Because the country is, in this sort of, are we in a recession, are we not kind of a state. Everybody's talking about it all the time in Washington. Read about it in the press. So instead of just randomly handing out all the money to all the normal suspects, why don't we take an opportunity? A crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? Why don't we take the crisis and use this as an opportunity to retool the energy infrastructure of the United States? It's very straightforward. Not a very hard idea, okay? So, and I've got a proposal. Unfortunately, I don't have everyone in agreement, so help me with this. It's very simple. What's the number one reason we're spending all this money on the military? Fundamentally because of oil security, right? So if we could make the price of oil be lower, that would be positive for other people, certainly not for, positive for us, not for everybody. If we can solve that problem by reducing demand, we've got another problem. We have an employment problem. We have a job creation problem. We have a high, now by the way, the jobs that are created in energy policy solar, geothermal, wind, are in fact high-paying blue-collar, white-collar jobs. And by the way, they're jobs in the US, in case anybody didn't pay attention. Furthermore, we have the best scientists and the best technology, the best research community in the world, people beginning to work on this. Maybe we could build export industries and get some of this stuff out and build some more revenue for the country. So it seems to me that you've solved, oh, and by the way, I forgot about climate change. If you actually did this, if you actually managed to figure out a way to replace, right, get this, replace all of the electricity generation in the country by renewable sources over a 20-year period, and you got rid of half of the car's use of gas on a per car basis, which again is achievable based on our analysis, you would cut our climate emissions by half. And by the way, this is a replicable strategy for all the other countries too. So we could show them how to do it. So I sat down and with a whole team sort of did this calculation, and it's actually pretty interesting. If you can achieve 100% US electricity generated by renewable electricity sources, 50% of the vehicles being plug-in hybrids, and I want to talk about that, and assuming that per capita energy consumption remains at the same levels as it has this year, which is, by the way, an easy target because it can clearly be made lower. Right? California's done this for years. We all know this. Our calculation was that the total cost of this was 2.7 trillion. Well, how are we going to come up with that money? That's a lot of money, even for the US. Well, the reason you can do it is because there's an offsetting 2.1 trillion in savings. Right? And the reason the savings occur is because of efficiencies. Remember that whole thing of that like increasing efficiency curve? And what's interesting is our calculations say that you can get, it turns out to be about using an 8% discount rate, it ends up being about $200 billion in net present value, which is roughly a fraction of what we spend on oil in this country. So even if you disagree with my methodology, there is a real opportunity right in front of us to actually solve this problem if people would stop arguing about all of the minor issues and start talking about the fundamental opportunity, which is to retool the energy infrastructure of the United States. And by the way, I forgot, right, because we're politicians here in the room, right? How many jobs does it create? 500,000 jobs in this calculation in wind alone. And by the way, we're not running out of wind, right? There's a lot of wind, right? The other thing to think about, and it's a big country. It's useful to have a big country with lots of wind. The other most interesting thing about it is that wind occurs all the time. There are no cases where the US has been becalmed, right? 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 That would be like historic. The wind stopped today. Sorry, we don't have any electric power because the wind stopped, right? You see my point. So we focused on solar, wind, and enhanced geothermal simply because they're the ones that are most likely. We explicitly ruled out nuclear power for a number of reasons, including the fact that it has infinitely high capital costs and it has lots of energy security issues. So if you imagine that the root problems are the energy mix is too carbon intensive, which has to do with history and so forth and so on, that the way we move the power is inefficient, we have the wrong price signals, the regulatory system is basically targeted to the existing incumbents. We all know this. The model that you want is a distributed renewable power structure with cogeneration and other sources that actually make the thing more efficient. We know how to do all of this now. It's just a matter of sitting in the room and saying, the payback is how long? Why are we not doing this now? It's actually right in front of us. Now, we all know the carbon intensity issue is basically a coal issue. And these plants that are being built are responsible for about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. Electricity is a large component of this. We all know the issues of climate change. The aging electric power infrastructure was designed without the kind of smart grid ideas that would be obvious to computer scientists, right? Obvious to people who sit in this. And there are reasons for it. They didn't have the switching technology. They didn't have the signaling technology. These things were built 20 or 30 years ago when the only kind of computer they could get was a mainframe, and they didn't want to put that, next to the power station. There's a lot of leakage in this network and so forth. The regulatory system, with the exception of a few states, including California, are incentivized around revenue rather than ROI and cost savings. That's a straightforward regulatory change that can be made on a per PUC basis or at a national level if they won't move fast enough. The cost of fossil fuels is not internalized into these systems, right? So all of these externalities are not in there. So how do you do this? Well, my ideal scenario would be to say, let's take everybody and let them all compete fairly without subsidies, and let's focus on efficiency first. The problem with that is that there are so many subtle subsidies for the existing fossil fuels that it's not really a fair strategy. Though you'd like to do that. Maybe you could wean them off. And and again, you all have heard a lot about these subsidies, but there are many, many, many in terms of special treatment around oil leases, various forms of tax credits, and so forth. Why don't we just take all those and shift them over to this other thing to help out? But my plan doesn't even require that. So why don't we figure out a way to work on energy efficiency? We're good at that. It requires good technology, good invention, and so forth. And when utilities pay people to make their buildings more efficient, they do it at about 1 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So one way to think about that on an economic basis is that investing in energy efficiency is cheaper than the cost of coal or the cost of wind or what have you, which is 5 cents and higher per kilowatt hour. So my important point here is that if we change the incentive so people start thinking about efficiency first, and businesses will do this. They will go and insulate their plants, make their businesses more efficient, and so forth and so on. And then the other thing that you have to do is you have to look at total cost of ownership. What happens is the way the accounting works and the way the executives work is they always think about a purchase rather than think of the life cycle cost. But the life cycle cost, especially with these increasing costs, becomes prohibitive. And by the way, the savings, typical example is you don't really need to replace the insulation in your house, but you have to replace the heater. The passive systems are much less likely to wear out than the active systems, which have motors and maintenance and so forth and so on. And by the way, all that labor costs go up and so forth. So if you take sort of capital plus operating budgets, you discover that you need to solve this problem. In Google's case, the capital and operating budgets for our data centers are owned by one person who happens to be in this room. Okay, so he's very, very good at making these sort of long-term trade-offs. And of course, the other trick is to create a real-time information loop. What happens is that there's a lot of evidence that things which are measured, consumption goes down. There have been a lot of studies about this. Smart meters with homes, for example, there's about a 10% reduction in use just by being aware of it. Now 10%, you go, no big deal. 10% over the United States in every home? Think about it. And we have the underlying computer technology, monitoring and so forth, to make these kinds of monitoring trivial. These are very small, simple devices, easily applied, again, and retrofitted into those systems. So consumers basically can understand all of this. The same thing has to do with PC equipment. One of the other interesting things about office buildings is that the computers, right, sort of my world, generates a lot of the electricity use. And a lot of those computers are not doing very much. In fact, a lot of the heat load and a lot of the ultimate electric load is driven by the fact that these computers are on all the time. So small changes in power management settings of your computers and so forth can actually make a big difference. There's a group called the Climate Savers Computing Initiative a number of computer companies are working on, which looks like it can basically, by raising these efficiency standards, this is roughly like the car companies actually welcoming raising their own efficiency standards, which is a separate discussion. You know, if we could basically meet these standards, we think we could take 11 million cars off the road. That's how big the electricity use and power use of personal computers and mainframes and data centers and so forth really is. Another example is building codes. Most commercial buildings are built to be leased. So again, the incentives aren't in alignment. Now you can fix this. Other countries, Sweden being the classic example, requires when these buildings are built to have huge amounts of insulation. Right? Again, you get this enormous, enormous payback. Fuel efficiency, everybody talks about it. Why don't we just fix that? Again, it's a call to action to better power, better performance, and of course, product efficiency standards. But the interesting thing is if you do all of that in efficiency, you can then start talking about wind, solar, thermal, and geothermal. And what's interesting about it is when I listen to it, well, the problem is the wind doesn't blow all the time. Solar thermal, well, you have to dig really deep. Geothermal, you have to dig really deep. Solar thermal, the sun doesn't shine all the time. Even in California, it rains occasionally. This obviously doesn't add. But if you do the math, and we actually mathematically model the likelihoods and probabilities of when things are on and off, they basically balance out so that they're roughly a permanently reliable sum. And by the way, the shocking discovery is that they're more reliable than power plants because power plants break. Right? And the wind continues to blow, the sun continues to shine, thank goodness, and of course the earth continues to be very hot. So in the wind case, we're very close on wind. I think people here know how successful the wind programs have been. The North Dakota is now known as the Saudi Arabia of wind, right? That's what they're claiming about. Texas is known as the Kuwait of wind. I'm not sure why one took, one took the other. You can guess. The important point is that wind is really becoming mainstream. And there are issues about getting, of course, wind power into the grid and so forth and so on, but all of that is going to happen. It looks like it's happening well. Solar thermal is interesting because you know that there's a shortage of photovoltaic panels and so forth and so on. But solar thermal is different. It basically, you take the sun, you heat up a fluid, so you're using essentially a mirror. And by the way, it looks really, really neat. It's like a space-age James Bondian type device. And those things are now being built all over the United States and all over Europe. And it's particularly good in deserts, right, for all the obvious reasons. So there are more than a dozen of these plants being built. And with the subsidies that are currently in the plan, they get economically roughly close to where they need to be. And this is roughly 1 million homes. So these are big, big numbers. By the way, if you took a 100-mile by 100-mile piece of the Southwest, which, by the way, there's a lot of 100 by 100-mile pieces of the Southwest that look pretty empty to me, that single square could power all of the United States if you didn't have transmission issues. So there's a lot of solar, and there's a lot of wind. And I forgot the underground. Enhanced geothermal, if it works, go in, fracture the rock, ship the water down or other surfaces, cycle it through. We understand this pretty well. Good jobs in the drilling and oil industry. Maybe a major game changer because, of course, it's 24 hours a day. We, Google, have decided with our renewable electricity less than coal initiative, and remember that's a formula, we like formulas. You can raise the price of coal or you can lower the price of renewable electricity. We think we can do this. We ourselves are investing, we've invested more than $10 million in wind and wind power related activities. We recently invested $10 million, $10+ million in enhanced geothermal activity. Governments have to have too. This is where this failure of leadership and failure of understanding what the opportunity is. Obviously increased federal R&D support for all of this, basically targeting renewable portfolios by state governments. Some are getting it, some are not. About half the states have portfolio standards around renewables and so forth and so on. You've got to solve the transportation problem. A rough analysis for you is that it's cheaper to operate a car on electricity than gasoline. If you look at the current hybrid situation, if you simply take the battery and make the battery bigger, and you put a normal plug in it and you plug it into your wall at night, this is very important, you roughly double the miles per gallon of the car. These are called plug-in hybrids. These plug-in hybrids look like they can make a material dent. The most extreme calculation that I found was one by Avery and Lovins, which roughly goes like this. If you move to hybrids, you get a factor of 2 over fuel use per mile, which is the metric you want to care about. If you move to plug-in hybrids, you get another factor of 2. If you move to E85, which everybody here knows about is 85% ethanol, you get another factor of 4. If you drive it the way optimal efficiency, you'll get another factor of 2. And that turns out that you've reduced the gas use in automobiles from 100% to 3% of what it was. So even if he's off by a factor of 2 or 4, imagine what that would do to the price of oil, given that that's sort of the largest consumer now of petroleum products. So we, of course, are doing a small fleet of hybrids to prove this point. There are now initiatives among many manufacturers that are trying to prove this model, and it looks like it's going to work. If you put a price on carbon, this would become a lot easier. Of course, there's a big debate as to whether you should have a carbon tax or a cap and trade. You can imagine which one is going to have more political momentum, the one that doesn't have the word tax in it. But anything that actually causes the externality of the price of carbon to be properly into these systems would help a lot. If we do that, and then we do one more thing, which is we've got to solve the grid problem. And this grid that we depend on, and we love our grid because without it we wouldn't have any power, right, is creaking for all the ways that you know. There's about a 9% efficiency loss in the current architecture. It's very inflexible. So it's very difficult to transmit things depending on where the sources are. So let's imagine a different structure. Let's apply a different model. And let's imagine, for example, that those cars that were charged at night had batteries in them that when they could just, the batteries are sitting there, right? Let's see if they could send that power back into the grid during the day. And you go, that's kind of a cheap trick, right? Because there's efficiency loss. You lose efficiency when you store the battery. Turns out the math is very interesting because most of the cost of power generation is the peak power cost. Very, very interesting. It's that top 10% when it's really hot and everybody's air conditioners are on. That's when all of the costs are. Because that's when, on the margin, you have to go to spot fuel and more expensive fuels. Because obviously, when there's low demand, you'll use your most efficient sources. So all of a sudden, you discover that if you can figure out a way to use batteries in cars, other ways of shifting load off of peak, and also reconfiguring the grid so that people can make money, and doing it in a material way, in off-peak hours and in peak hours in particular, giving power back to utilities, all of a sudden it works really, really well. Why does this not occur today? The grid isn't really owned by anybody. It isn't really managed right. People don't really understand how to architect these things at the regulator level. But the technology is right there. So when I look at this sort of smart grid and what is called the vehicle-to-grid, V2G. And I imagine sort of the smart garage where I just sort of plug my car in and the computers handle it and the right thing happens and it always works and it's always incredibly efficient. And by the way, I make money by cost shifting, so I love my car. I especially love my car parked in my garage, right? Sure sounds to me like a distributed computing problem. Sure sounds to me like the internet, and sure sounds to me like personal computers. Now, speaking as a computer scientist, I'm sure that there are a lot of complexities that we're talking about, but what I see foremost before us is an opportunity that is the largest opportunity that I could possibly imagine, right? It's an opportunity that solves energy security, which is a lot having to do with war, and war is bad, energy price, an opportunity to create jobs and investment and opportunity before us. Oh, and by the way, solve the biggest problem facing the planet aside from nuclear proliferation, which is climate change. With that, thank you very much. Thank you.
We can take a few questions from Eric. So, anybody want to ask a question?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
First place, there are people working on better architectures. There is a transmission problem. We're not and I had fun with my 100 by 100 mile, square mile example, but that's not how you do it. The model of power generation is going to be distributed. You're going to have a combination of a relatively large number of gas turbines, which are quite, sort of mid-sized in this technology, and then a pretty good mixture of smaller sources of generation, of which solar thermal will be one. But I think a reasonable assumption is the way we're going to solve, since we're not going to solve the grid problem in the next year or two, we're going to be forced to having perhaps more of these than we would like. That is a less efficient structure. But there's still lots and lots of solar sources. By the way, it's sunny very near Southern California. It's sunny very near Northern California. It's sunny very near most of the places, certainly in the West. The East Coast turns out to have a lot of enhanced geothermal and a fair amount of wind. So again, depending on the situation, one size does not fit all, and you have to look at it. There are enough people now doing California desert-based solar solutions that do, in fact, pencil out, even with the existing assumptions about the grid, which is a problem, that I think that with a little bit more focus on the grid, we can get that one solved. Yes, yes.
Thank you. I'm curious, if all of this sounds as good as we like to think, why isn't it happening more? And you talk about politicians, but in the business community.
Well, it's interesting. The Rocky Mountain Institute wrote a report in 2004, right, which talked a lot about this, right? And so there have been a lot of people in my research, and I'm new to this, a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. And I think, frankly, cheap oil made it easy to ignore the good work and the good work on efficiency. The question is, do you think the era of cheap oil will come back? And I'm assuming it's not. I think it's a reasonable assumption. And even if it did come back, it would be bad from a climate change. So I think it's fundamentally because Political systems in democracies tend to work on the urgent rather than the important. I do think that it's a failure of leadership. I think this is what I like about this opportunity is if we can tie the short-term problems we have, which are jobs, jobs, taxes, all the usual problems, and on high current energy prices, maybe we can break through this. Whereas having an intellectual conversation a few years ago, you just couldn't get anybody's attention. Well, in the first place, on Google's, our sell side, we have a very large, most of our energy use is, in fact, in our data centers. And Bill Weil talked about it earlier today, so I did not want to cover over his material. We have a very, very sophisticated program about really understanding the amount of power that we use. And the answer on our data centers is very simple. If we can get our computers to be more used, we have fewer computers, therefore we generate less power needs, and therefore everything else works. So the simplest answer about computer efficiency turns out to be keeping them at 100% rather than 20% or 30% or 40%. One of the great tragedies about all these computers that are sitting in you guys' offices running is they're not doing anything. What are they doing? Running Windows? It's not, there's just not that much computation required. And there's just not much going on, right? So they're just sitting there. And think about it if they were really heavily used, how much smaller and how much less power they could use. Now on the measurement side, we've got a number of initiatives where we're looking at end user ideas about measurement. But virtually all of the end user measurement things require collaborations with a utility. So the utilities have to decide to expose on a per person, per household measurable data, and then companies like Google and people here in the room can write software that will basically take that stuff and do lots of interesting stuff with it. But you have to make the data available.
Eric, a question over here.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Amy.
You all are doing a lot on the R&D and investment front. I was wondering if you could talk about the policy piece, given the importance of decoupling from the other policy initiatives that you talked about.
Well, there's a lot going on in policy, and it's basically a lot of conversations with politicians trying to get them to understand these calculations. Everybody would like to hear these messages, but they often don't understand the subtle trade-offs. The single best thing to do is to try to come up with state or national standards around efficiency, and then remove the barriers to renewables. And obviously, the fact that the government cannot even extend the renewables tax credit is another tragedy, another failure of leadership.
There's a question over here. Katie?
Well, because we care so much about it, Google's been doing the math. We're trying to figure out a way to get this kind of calculation done. What bothered me is I would go to these meetings and I'd say, okay, I'm tired of everyone grousing about it. Show me a plan. Even if it doesn't foot, show me a plan. So I've produced a plan. Now, if you don't like my plan, produce your own plan. What's your alternative? Death, right? Right? Seriously. So this plan is a Google plan based on the data that we have. There are other people. Al Gore, for example, announced something which was sort of a similar approach with a different set of assumptions, shorter time frame, did not cover cars, covered electricity, which is is another example of a plan. And there's a few other people working on them.
Did you come out publicly, or?
I just did today. That's right. Well, again, it's a hypothetical question. It's always a mistake to answer hypothetical questions on stage. Businesses, well-run businesses have people who can do spreadsheets, and they can do these calculations correctly. And I think most companies and most CEOs that I've talked with are going to do these pretty much regardless of the cost of oil. And the reason is that under any set of assumptions, right, the investments in the various passive investments, for example, the investments in reducing your use, efficiency uses, pencil out under all assumptions. And those are just good, and so everybody's doing them. And that's a big business. Many, many billions of dollars of building retrofits, business energy process retrofits, those kinds of things. How would consumers behave? I think we all have seen this complex relationship between oil price, Hummers and that sort of stuff. And that's a case where the government really has to decide how much regulation they want to put. But the fact of the matter is that there's a good opportunity. It's very difficult to raise the gas tax when gas prices are high. It's very easy to raise a gas tax when gas prices are low. So an obvious thing to do in that scenario would be to try to increase the gas tax, and then as gas prices then go back up, because of course they're going back up, because we're eventually running out, so prices will eventually go to infinity, right? Is you lower that tax. As to whether that's really going to happen in the U.S. political system, I'll let you decide.
So you, as the CEO, obviously sit in the
Tell them that it increases their earnings and decreases their expenses. Corporate America.
Do you have that experience when you're sitting at dinner with them?
Yeah. The problem is people want to solve the problem, but it's, by the way, American corporations are accumulating cash at a huge rate. Anybody notice this? Right? The cash hoards are getting bigger for various reasons involving accounting and the way these companies are run and the way that you can do cash and acquisitions and so forth. So companies have the cash. I mean, I could understand if you said, well, I really want to go invest in efficiency, but I can't get the cash and I'm not going to go to the debt market to borrow it because interest rates are too high. Most companies, in fact, have very good capital lines. So I disagree with that line of reasoning, and I think that opportunity is before them. It's just a math problem. And by the way, the numbers are big because you look at it over a 1 or 2 year period, it's pretty interesting. You look at it over a 5 or 10 year period, under any set of assumptions, it's huge contribution. So again, CEOs are supposed to look at the long-term value of shareholders, not the short-term, long-term. This is one of the best things that you can do for the long-term value of shareholders.
Eric, I had a question, which is you showed Google Earth and how the borders of countries were easily identified
Wasn't that
by
fun?
the policies. How can you kind of give that to the whole world so people in different countries?
Well, I can just imagine you planting an M and an R in trees. You're such an ecological person.
So you know what I'm saying? How can the people in Mexico have access to that data so they can go to their government and politicians?
It's called earth.google.com, and they can download it.
Okay, but I think it would be a phenomenal asset.
No, again, what we're trying to do with Google is we're trying to use this as a platform, obviously, to communicate. You can have fun with it, and so forth. But one of the most important things people are doing with Google Earth is they're building overlays. My favorite overlay is the overlay that shows the flooding of the U.S. Capitol as sea levels rise, right? So eventually what happens is the only building left is the U.S. Capitol, and all the other buildings, all those K Street buildings, all the White House, they're all gone. And just because it comes out, the water comes up out of the tidal basin. And if that doesn't scare you, you're not paying attention. Yes, sir?
I'd ask this question.
I think that one of the issues is that these sort of generic calculators don't really get interesting until they have real data. So we need to have data sources. And I think one of our messages to people who have the data is make it available on the web. And companies like Google and specialized companies and so forth can get advantage of it. Yes, go ahead. If you use the part per million calculations, we're at 300 and some odd parts per million right now. Current projections have us in various cases under business as usual going well to 450, 550. 550 was in one of the major reports. 450 was in another. 450 corresponds to 5 degrees Fahrenheit temperature rise across a lot of the populated parts of the Earth, and that does include some sea level rise and a fair amount of ecological destruction. The problem that I have is that the modeling makes some assumptions that I think are unlikely unless politicians and our leadership act, and so we're on a path to exceeding the 550. And those are situations where we would essentially have a repeat of sort of the kind of global calamities that have occurred, every so many millions of years in America, in the world. It's worth noting that oil and oil shale originally came from global warming, 200 or some random number of 200 million years ago, when the oceans became acidic, all the plants died. They eventually went to the bottom of the ocean, and then over the period of that many years turned into oil. So we're in a situation where if we don't act, we could eventually cause that to occur. And then the cycle, of course, the problem is all the people would be dead, before that cycle was over. It'd be replaced by something else, I guess. It's a terrible, terrible image. So we have to take it very, very seriously. So the climate change issue is very, very serious, and the things that I'm talking with are part of the solution. It will ultimately require not just a U.S. action, which is what I'm advocating, but also all of the other actions that people here know about.
One last question. Go ahead.
What are your thoughts about using wave energy
Yeah, the data barges is a clever idea. I'm not aware of us building any at the moment, but at Google, you never know. And by the way, the idea was we patented the idea of a data center on a barge in the ocean, using wave power to power the data center. You know, you never know. So the studies on wave indicate that there's a lot of wave power. There's issues of sighting. There's issues of silting. There's issues of the depth at which you put the paddles and other structures. There's a couple of initiatives where people are trying these. There have been a number of pretty successful experiments. The reason I focused on the 3 that I did is that we have proof points of them working pretty well. So I would view the wave one as an example of maybe a 4th or a 5th one that may come. And I think we want to encourage all of that.
One last one.
The lady over there had a question.
Okay.
I have not publicly endorsed any candidate, and I would love all of the candidates to stop focusing on some of the short-term things and take this as an opportunity to go and actually solve all these problems in parallel, which I think can be done. Yes, ma'am.
Mine is not really a question. It's more of a plea to you as the chairman of a very public, high-profile company to use your position to give your plan to the leadership, whatever it may be, and to share it with other CEOs, because we really need that conversation to happen in the C-level suite. So, and I'm not assuming that you are not doing this already, but I would really hope that you don't underestimate the opportunity that you have to make a huge difference.
Well, thank you very much. Okay.